In November of 1913, nature unleashed one of the most violent and unforgiving storms the Great Lakes had ever seen. Though it never touched an ocean, it grew to rival a full hurricane, roaring with brutal winds, pounding snow, and monstrous waves as high as 35 feet. Imagine being on a steel ship in the middle of that chaos with walls of water slamming down and ice sealing the decks. This is the story of the White Hurricane, the most devastating natural disaster in the history of the Great Lakes. Viewer discretion is advised. Intro music. When most people picture lakes, they think of calm waters, small ripples, and familiar shorelines visible in every direction. But for those who've lived or worked near the Great Lakes of North America, the reality can be very different. Anyone caught in a storm out there knows these waters behave more like inland seas, or in the worst cases, like oceans in full rage. The Great Lakes, which straddle the border between the United States and Canada, make up the largest connected group of freshwater lakes on Earth. Together, they cover nearly 94,000 square miles, or about 244,000 square kilometers, and hold a staggering 21% of the planet's freshwater supply. To put that into perspective, if you could pour all the Great Lakes across the North American continent, the entire landmass would be buried under about 5 feet of water. The lakes themselves, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, are so vast that their horizons stretch beyond sight, and their waters often mimic the moods of an ocean. They can form powerful currents, whip up endless waves, and reach startling depths. Lake Superior, the largest and deepest of them all, plunges to 1,332 feet, or 406 meters, at its lowest point. Because of their enormous size, the Great Lakes even generate their own weather. Like the seas, they take much longer to warm in summer and cool in winter compared to the land around them. During colder months, ice often spreads over their shorelines, but the centers remain unfrozen, releasing heat and moisture into the frigid air. This fuels a phenomenon called lake effect snow, bands of heavy, unpredictable snowfall that can bury towns under feet of powder with little warning. Today, meteorologists can usually forecast these patterns with some degree of accuracy, but back in the early 1900s, weather prediction was still a primitive science. And when the White Hurricane formed in November 1913, ship captains and their crews were left almost blind to what was coming. For centuries, the Great Lakes have been vital trade routes. The lakes are connected through waterways that allow a freighter leaving Duluth, Minnesota, at the western edge of Lake Superior to eventually reach the Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence River in New York. This made them the highways of industry. In the early 20th century, particularly for transporting coal, iron ore, and grain, but the safety net for sailors was thin. By 1913, the United States Weather Bureau, now the National Weather Service, was in operation, but forecasting tools were limited. Observations had to be collected by hand, weather maps were drawn manually, and by the time storm warnings reached ship captains, conditions often had already changed. To alert sailors, harbors used a system of flags, pennants, and lanterns to signal approaching winds, their direction, and whether precipitation was expected. But even this system lagged far behind the speed at which the Great Lakes could turn from calm to catastrophic. When the storm of November 1913 erupted, no signal or warning could keep pace. The month of November has always been dangerous on the lakes. It's the season when warm southern air collides with cold Canadian blasts, creating volatile systems. On November 7, 1913, the 470-foot steamer L.C. Waldo departed Minnesota, bound for Ohio with a full load of iron ore. On board were 22 crew members, the captain's wife, her mother, and even the ship's dog. Conditions were calm, and the air, unusually warm for the season, but brewing to the north and south were two clashing systems: frigid Canadian winds and warm, moist Gulf air. As they collided, a low-pressure system began spinning over the Great Lakes, feeding on the moisture of the still warm waters. By November 6th, it had started to mimic the rotation of a hurricane. The Weather Bureau, however, had only predicted brisk winds and light rain. For Captain John W. Duddleson of the Waldo, this seemed routine, and like many other captains, he pressed ahead. But by the morning of November 7th, signal stations across the Great Lakes raised red storm flags. The wind was already gusting to hurricane strength. By nightfall, Lake Superior was being pounded with sustained winds of 60 miles per hour and gusts over 80. For reference, hurricane force winds are anything above 74 mm/h. Waves were building to towering heights, nearly matching the Waldo's own hull. The Waldo fought to stay upright as the storm bore down. Heavy snow and freezing rain slashed visibility. Decks iced over rapidly, making every step deadly. By 9 p.m., Captain Duddleson was navigating only by compass, the world outside swallowed in white. Desperate for shelter, he steered toward Manitou Island in hopes of calmer waters. But before the ship could reach it, a massive rogue wave slammed into the Waldo, shattering the pilot house and destroying navigational equipment. The crew scrambled through ice-coated decks to retrieve a spare compass from a lifeboat. As the ship drifted closer to Manitou, disaster struck. The Waldo's rudder failed, leaving it helpless in the storm's grip. Within hours, the ship smashed violently into a rocky outcropping known as Gull Rock. Many captains would have abandoned ship immediately, but Duddleson made a fateful decision. He ordered the engines kept at full power to wedge the bow firmly into the rock, preventing waves from tossing the ship back into open waters. This gamble held, though at terrible cost. The hull cracked open, and the stern eventually sheared off and sank. With no power, no heat, and a storm raging outside, the survivors crowded into a single compartment near the bow. To keep from freezing, they tore apart the ship's bathtub and buckets, fashioned a makeshift stove, and burned wood scavenged from the wreck itself. Against the odds they endured, even as the white hurricane spread across the lakes. While the Waldo clung to Gull Rock, the storm grew monstrous. By November 8th, it stretched across the entire basin of Lake Superior and was now sweeping east. On Lake Huron, gale warnings were hoisted, but many captains pressed forward, believing their steel ships could endure. The Weather Bureau issued its morning forecast on November 9th, but it failed to detect a second low-pressure system racing northwest from the Carolinas. As the two systems collided, winds screamed to 80 and even 90 miles per hour. Snow blinded sailors and waves reached terrifying heights. That night, between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m., 8 ships sank on Lake Huron alone, claiming 187 lives in just 6 hours. Across the Great Lakes, vessels capsized or vanished, their crews swallowed by icy black water. The white hurricane now rivaled a Category 1 hurricane in power. On land, cities like Cleveland were buried under nearly 1.5 feet of snow, with drifts over 6 feet high. Streetcars stalled in place, stranding passengers for days. Back at Gull Rock, the Waldo's survivors had no idea whether anyone knew of their fate. Supplies of food and water were running out. Rescue stations on shore received word of their plight, but the storm made reaching them almost impossible. From Eagle Harbor, Michigan, a small 26-foot motorboat launched into the maelstrom. Freezing spray encrusted the vessel so quickly that some rescuers were frozen to their seats and had to be chopped free with axes when they returned. Another attempt from Portage Harbor failed head-on against the winds, but the crew rerouted through inland waterways to approach Gull Rock from the south. Finally, on November 11th, after the storm had blown itself eastward, the rescuers reached the Waldo. The wreck was encased in thick ice, its bow resembling a frozen mountain. Survivors inside heard the rescuers' shouts and called back weakly, but the room's door was sealed shut by ice inside and out. Axes hacked away at the frozen barrier until the door finally cracked open. One by one, all 24 people on board, including the captain's wife, her mother, and the ship's dog, were brought safely onto the rescue vessels. Against all odds, every life on the Waldo had been saved. The scale of destruction elsewhere was staggering. Over 4 days, at least 19 ships were destroyed, another 19 stranded, and 250 lives lost. 3/4 of those deaths happened during the 6-hour window on the night of November 9th. The financial toll was estimated at $4.8 million, equivalent to nearly $150 million today. For decades, the white hurricane haunted the Great Lakes shipping industry. Entire families had lost fathers, brothers, and sons to the storm. Ports mourn dozens of sailors whose bodies never returned. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the region. On the 100th anniversary in 2013, meteorologists recreated the storm using modern simulation tools. They confirmed wind gusts over 80 mph, waves over 36 feet high, and hurricane-like conditions lasting more than 20 hours on Lake Superior alone. Lake Erie endured 16 hours, Michigan 13, and Huron 10. Even with modern technology, such a storm would challenge today's ships. In 1913, with primitive forecasts and little warning, it was a recipe for catastrophe. The White Hurricane stands as a chilling reminder of the Great Lakes fury, a disaster born not from oceans, but from freshwater seas that proved just as deadly. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoy stories like these,